Hi, welcome to TFR Newsroom. I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartiya, and we have with us today, once again, Chris Grams, Head of Marketing at Tidelift. Chris, it's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be here again. Thanks for inviting me.
And today we're going to talk about Tidelift Open Source Maintainer Survey report for this year. Before we get started, can you just give me the premise of this report? What is the whole idea that is behind this report?
Well, look, we at Tidelift, we're working with open source maintainers every day. We work with hundreds of open source maintainers. And so what we wanted to do with this report is we had not really seen a place where people had gone and done a deep analysis of what makes open source maintainers do the work they do. You know, a lot of these people we suspected from what we had heard probably do this work in a volunteer capacity, are doing it unpaid. And so we wanted to get some real data on that because we hadn't seen any good data on the number of maintainers and the percentage of maintainers that get paid. But we also wanted to learn more about like what they like about their work, what they don't like about their work, because the reality is that most of our application infrastructure today relies on this code that they write. And so all of our businesses should care about the health of these open source maintainers and how they're doing and how they're funding their work, because that's what we count on to build our applications.
Right, and you're absolutely right about knowing, how many are on payrolls versus how many are doing these things in their free time. I think Linux Foundation, they do some reports, especially the kernel, everything. So they are seeing that the number of developers who are getting paid to do this in their daytime, day job is kind of growing and increasing. But since you work closely with open source maintainer, can you talk about, based on this report, how are things looking today? Do you have any stats that you can share?
Yeah, a couple of high-level findings. First off, on the number of maintainers that are getting paid, we surveyed almost 400 maintainers, and again, we made a distinction between broader contributors to open source and open source maintainers, the people who have write privileges to the software. So ours is specifically focused on the people who can actually who actually have write privileges on the software. What we found is that almost half of them, 46%, reported that they do not get paid one penny for their work. And only 26%, so a fourth of these maintainers, make more than $1,000 a year. So the majority of maintainers are earning either nothing or pizza money for their work. Yeah, another highlight that we found is we really wanted to understand from maintainers like why they do the work. What makes them do this? And the number one reason why maintainers told us they enjoy doing their open source maintenance work is because they believe they're making a positive impact on the world. So 71% of maintainers said that they do it because they can make a positive impact. The next highest one was it allows them to fulfill the need for creative, challenging, and enjoyable work, which was 63%, and they like working on projects that matter to them, which came in 59%. You know, what's really interesting is the thing that came in dead last of the things maintainers enjoy is getting paid for their work. And so you could look at it and you could say, gosh, well, does that mean that maintainers are doing it, as a volunteer activity on purpose? Like they don't want to get paid. They care more about making a difference. And, some have speculated that that's the case. When we look deeper into the findings, we realized that that is actually not the case at all. Because when we looked at just that pool of people who said they enjoy getting paid, only 18% of the people who are getting paid less than $1,000 a year say getting paid is a reason they enjoy being a maintainer. But that rises to 30% enjoy getting paid for those making $1,000 to $10,000. And get this, if they're making more than $10,000 a year, 61% of them enjoy getting paid. So basically, the reason why more maintainers don't enjoy getting paid is because they're not getting paid. Those who do get paid enjoy it.
Right. And you're also saying, you talked about the pizza money, and you also talked about, the number of people who are getting paid. There are a couple of things I want to get into a cultural aspect as well. I don't know if you're collecting that data. I once talked to Linus Torvalds, and he said, that a lot of, in Europe, the situation is totally different. Education is free. You don't have to really worry about your career at that point. So a lot of people, they do find time to contribute to the common good kind of things versus different. I hail from India, and career is one of the primary. You have to start investing early on. In the US also situation is different. So have you also seen anything culturally where a lot of open source projects, actually the whole Linux kernel that comes from Europe. So do you see culture also plays a role when people say, you know what, I'm just doing it just for fun?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we actually did separate out some of our responses by geography, and so we saw some differences between what was fun about open source maintenance, whether you lived in North America or Europe or Asia. And I think some of your inclination, some of what you said there, actually proved out in the results. In fact, we have reports that basically show the difference. So, like respondents from Asia told us that they enjoy improving their skills, and the general level of learning came in second. Those are the things that are most positive about being a maintainer for them. But those like ranked much lower for North Americans. I think seventh is like improving skills came in seventh versus coming in third for people in Asia, for example. Oh, I was just to say, we also saw some differences in terms of the things that maintainers disliked as well. The number one dislike, by the way, like when we asked them what they dislike about being an open source maintainer, pretty much roundly around the world, was not being financially compensated enough for their work. No surprise there. If most maintainers are making less than $1,000 US a year, and then also adds to my personal stress was another one. But another thing that was kind of interesting is the loneliness of being a maintainer was not as much of an issue for people in North America as it was for Europe. So in Europe, the fact that being a maintainer can be lonely was the third thing that people dislike versus eighth in North America. So we did see some significant changes geographically around the world.
What is kind of strange and surprising is, and you are well aware of this fact, that there is a huge kind of gap in supply and demand of talent, especially in the cloud world. Once again, Linux Foundation and a lot of other companies, organizations, they keep coming up with reports that we need more developers. There are not enough developers, especially with all these latest technology that are coming up. So why do you see there is a kind of unbalance between people getting paid versus there is a huge demand for talent people as well? So are we looking at open source maintainers who are maintaining projects which are not playing any role in the enterprise area, or they are not getting exposure? Why is this gap there?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that we really wanted to look at is that we were coming in with a strong point of view that maybe the amount of maintainers from different places around the world was being hindered, and people being able to contribute to open source was being hindered by this fact that there's not compensation for maintainers. If you think about it, one of the sad truths is the vast majority of maintainers come from Western countries, mainly male, mainly privileged. And if you think about it, the reason why that probably is the case is because if you say you take care of an aging parent outside of your work hours, or you have 3 or 4 children at home, or you have to take a second job because in your country it's hard to make ends meet, if open source maintainer work is a volunteer activity, you don't qualify to do it by nature of the fact that it's not paid work, right? So one of the things we asked about whether maintainers believed that there was an opportunity to increase the diversity of contributors to open source, and we asked them more for their ideas about what they could do about it. In fact, 7 out of 10 maintainers agreed that open source suffers from a lack of diversity and would benefit if contributors came from a wider set of backgrounds and experiences, and only 9% disagreed with that statement. So, I think that is a little bit of a motherhood and apple pie kind of thing, that most people would agree that diversity matters. But in the case of open source, I think it really matters, because literally we could have more great code being developed if we could increase the number of people from different backgrounds around the world who were able to contribute because they were getting paid to contribute as either part of their day job or maybe even as a new career, like the idea of a paid open source maintainer, like a professional independent open source maintainer as a career, that if you were living somewhere in India and didn't have access to a Western salary, that maybe you could start up some new projects, figure out a way to, through things like Tidelift or other similar efforts, get paid for your work, and then eventually have that be your day job, earning a Western salary, no matter where you live in the world. So that's kind of the dream that we had hoped for. And we see appetite in this maintainer survey for more work to be done on increasing the diversity of contributors.
Yeah, this is something strange because when we look at open source, I talked to Kelsey Hightower and he said, the kind of background he comes from, you see most of the people go to sports and everything, but he became software developer. And he was like, the fact is that open source, you don't have to prove yourself before you get involved with every other thing. You have to prove yourself. If you want to get a job, you have to have college degree and all those things. Open source lowers the bar. And sometimes you don't even know who the maintainer is because all you see is their handle on GitHub or email address. You don't know whether they're male, female, black, white, brown. It doesn't matter. So open source lowers the barrier for entry. Yes, of course, depending on where you look at it, the communication, we are working on the improving culture, so that when you get involved, the environment is more welcoming. But once again, I see a conflict that open source does create a field where anybody can just come in and start contributing. So once again, why this gap there? There should not be a case that, hey, there should be more people, there should be more diversity. Open source should actually be the more diverse, but it is not.
Yeah, and that's and I would speculate, and the reason why I think that is, and we see some of this in our maintainer survey results, is that it is like open source is a great leveler. Like as you said, almost anyone from any background can contribute. Nobody's looking at your resume to see where you got your coding degree from. The code speaks. If it's good and people feel like it deserves to be included in a project, it can be. If you create your own project and users come and want to use it, all of a sudden you could be running a project that's used by millions of developers around the world. The problem that comes in is if you don't have a way to fund the continued work on that project or keeping it up to an enterprise standard, how do you sustain that work over time? And I think this is the thing that really causes some of those people who are starting and moving into open source contributor roles from more diverse backgrounds and different places around the world from continuing and being more successful. I think it does come down to money in some cases. Is like if you have a day job where you have to work 40 hours a week doing something not related to your open source maintenance work, and you're doing it as a hobby, it feels really good when you get that millionth developer using your software. And then after that, when you get sort of overwhelmed with bug report requests and people wanting new features and you're not getting paid for it, at some point it becomes kind of a burden. And that's what we saw in our maintainer survey results is if you look at the things that people said they don't like about being an open source maintainer, I think I said earlier that the number one thing was not getting financially compensated, but that's not the only thing. Adds to my personal stress, 45%. Feel underappreciated or like the work is thankless, 40%. More than half of maintainers have considered quitting or have quit maintaining a project. And the more projects they maintain, the more likely they are to quit. And so I think what that shows is that there's the dream of being an open source maintainer, getting started, getting to work, getting to do this cool stuff, getting the affirmation that your work matters and your work is good and feeling like you're making a difference. And then the honeymoon ends when you're maintaining the code that big businesses depend on and you're not getting compensated for your effort. And that's what we saw in the survey.
When they are not getting paid, and as you said, sometimes they walk out and the more projects they hand, there's burnout. That also means that those open source projects are not sustainable. The companies who rely on those projects, they're taking a big risk. So not only from the perspective of the survey, but Tidelift as a company who works closely with open source maintainers, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that is really critical for folks to understand about the plight of open source maintainers. If you could look at this survey and you could sort of say, hey, this is not my problem, like that open source maintainers aren't getting paid. I'm not responsible for figuring out the business model for open source. That would be a short-sighted point of view if your business relies on open source, because it's in your interest for open source maintainers not just to have their work be sustained, but for open source maintainers to thrive. Because if they're thriving, and they're getting compensated not just enough to get by. That's why, like, when you hear about open source sustainability, that word sustainability for me, that doesn't go far enough. Like, I want to see millionaire open source maintainers. I want to see billionaire open source maintainers eventually. Like, why is it that you have companies that are these unicorn businesses that are built entirely on the backs of open source software, and you have their founders getting rich? Meanwhile, the open source maintainers who create this still have a day job. As we found in our survey, 70% of them did. So, to me, the real issue, if you're a user, a consumer, like an enterprise consumer of open source, the reason you should care about maintainers getting paid is because your ticket to getting better software to build the business that you have is open source maintainers being able to fund their continued work. And if they can more than just sustain it, if they can thrive and do really well, they'll make even more amazing code that you can run your business on, and it'll get better and better. So my feeling is, and I think the perspective of Tidelift, is that there's a balance here where the needs of maintainers, they want to get paid for the incredible work they do. And on the other side, your enterprise users, they just want to have software they can rely on that, continues to get better and continues to innovate. And we can do both. We don't have to make a choice between the two, but it takes an understanding on the side of the enterprise development teams that the needs of maintainers actually, if we serve their needs, it benefits us as an organization as well. When we get that equation right, I think that's when open source is really, really going to thrive.
When you're saying earlier is that they get excited, they start an open source project, or they get involved with the open source project. I actually look at it typical open source. When we look at open source solution, they solve day one problem. You can download the code, you can get started with it. But what happened day two? When you have to maintain it, manage it, update it, upgrade it. That's where commercial support enters the picture. When you start, companies start offering support. Same thing, open source. Day one you can get started with the project, but on day two, which is getting commercial, for your own survival commercial backing. You also mentioned something where companies should look at it. I sometimes feels that a lot of open source projects where companies get involved, they look at it, and even folks like Linus, they look at their own code and their contribution as selfish contributors. They don't want contribution which is out of charity, because then charity will go away tomorrow. Selfish contribution helps because it's helping you. That's why you're helping that. There is a very good symbiotic relationship where companies are leveraging that open source project, and that is why they're funding a development, because they want to benefit. It's much easier to fund an open source developer versus having a team of developers. So what do you think about this aspect of this problem?
Yeah, I think that's really important. The idea that if you even think of the way that open source contributors start working, usually they're, the sort of phrase is they're trying to scratch their own itch, like they have a problem and they want to create a piece of code that actually solves that problem. Or like at a bigger scale, like you're talking about, an entire enterprise decides they need to build on a particular type of infrastructure. So they want to hire a bunch of open source developers to continue to maintain and grow that software in an open, collaborative way as open source. So that's a great motivation to build open source. And the question is, like, where does it hit the place where the needs of the customers of that open source outweigh the investment that either the individual is making or the company is making? And what we found is that in many cases, it feels like the demands from the users outweigh the time and the compensation / motivation that the maintainers have. There's one great quote that I think was actually came from somebody else, but it was written in the write-in responses for the report. It was, being an open source maintainer is like living in Goodwill Hunting in reverse. You start out as a respected genius and you end up as a janitor who gets into fights. Like that really sort of strikes me as the perfect articulation of what many maintainers go through. Is when they first create and they're in contribution mode, they're a genius, they're well respected, and then over time they end up in this like overwhelming maintenance mode, sort of fighting with people about what new feature gets to be added, why they aren't taking something in a particular direction, why they're not fixing a particular bug fast enough, all that sort of stuff. So Again, there's reasons. The reasons why people get into open source are that they want to make a difference and they want to do something meaningful. And then the reasons why they end up quitting is it becomes sort of a brutish exercise where they're getting into fights.
Excellent. Yeah, no, you summed it very well. Now, you folks are also hosting an event next week. It's called Upstream. Uh, Tell me a bit more about the event itself.
Well, first off, Upstream is a first year event that we're doing as part of something called Maintainer Week, where we're not the only people hosting an event. We're hosting the first event, Upstream, a celebration of open source and open source maintainers, intended as an audience for anybody who builds applications with open source. But we're going to have lots of maintainers speaking at that event. And then later in the week, GitHub is actually sponsoring their own maintainer event on Tuesday and Wednesday. So it's a whole week devoted to open source maintainers, which we hope to do going forward in coming years as well, and hopefully back in person at some point. But this is a free virtual event. We actually have a panel of really well-known established open source maintainers that's going to be discussing these survey results in detail. So if you're interested in learning more and hearing perspectives from some maintainers whose projects you might use, you can sign up and join. Just go to upstream.live. Like I said, it's free to sign up. And this event is on Monday, June 7th. So depending on when this airs, it may be either before the event, or if the event's already happened, you can still go to the website and watch the recordings.
Chris, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about this. Is a very topic that is close to my heart, because open source and commercialization, both sides, not only as a product company but also for maintainer, is really important. So thanks for sharing not only the highlights from the survey but also your own insights. And I am also excited to look and see what the Upstream event is going to tell us more. So thanks for your time, and I would love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It's always fun to have a conversation with you.